I've muted everybody. You can always message me if you can't. All right, over to you, Andy.
Okay, thank you very much. So the overall title of the series is not very snappy, I'm afraid, but it does say what's on the tin. The tin says what's inside it. Marx's Capital, which I'll deal with mostly today, Labour Super Exploitation, which I'll look at next time, and then really what we all want to do together is a fresh take on the transformation problem, which is the first three parts of volume 3 of CapVol3. So that's the series. So the topic today is the structure of Marx's Capital as informed by Hegel's science of logic. My overall purpose for the series is that Marx's main work should take much fuller account of systematic oppressive labour conditions, starting with slavery, but that's just the beginning of a very long story, 500 years and more, of colonial, neo-colonial labour exploitation, which I think is rightly broadly stated as labour super exploitation. That's really my main purpose, to bring those two things together. What I found in doing this project is a particular set of issues around the beginning of volume 3. What it deals with there is how Marx explains the way in which surplus value becomes profit. For most of, well, for all of volume 1 and volume 2, they're assumed to be identical. They're assumed to be equivalent, basically. Well, and what Marx does is he relaxes that assumption and explains actually they cannot be. And this is known as the transformation problem. And it's actually generated a whole load of debate for about a century and a half. And I want to come back to that controversy because I think it actually is extremely important in understanding how super exploitation of labour manifests itself in capitalism. So, I mean, my take on Marx's Capital is that it's the best theoretical starting point, but it needs amending. So in the first lecture, I'll basically do what I think is the starting point. Next time, I'm going to say why I think it needs amending. And then lectures on from there will go into more detail in terms of both volume 1 and volume 3, what I think needs to be amended in Marx's Capital. And then finally, towards the end, I'll emphasize a lot more. Okay, so in what way do we want to take it forward? Amending to what? What does that lead us to? And in sort of academic terms, I guess, I think I'm really arguing 5 theses. Some of these are very complementary. You could probably boil this down to about 3 theses. The first one is I'm going to argue today that Marx borrowed an awful lot from Hegel's logic. He did rework Hegel's logic in a materialist way, but the 3 concepts of appearance, essence, and actuality, which Hegel uses extensively, Marx also used extensively in the structure of Capital. In fact, it gives us a good insight into understanding the structure of Marx's argument. So that's what I'm going to cover today. But just to expand on what I've already said about the purpose overall of doing this, I think that the social oppressions that are associated with labour super exploitation, which we could also include here gender oppression. I quite like the term which I see has been adopted by Mark van Linden, which I like, is I think that these are all aspects of what you might call relational inequality. And I think that they're significant in their own right, but I think that the violation of equality is inherent in the capitalist mode of production. And that is a problem in Capital, right? So next thesis is, in terms of what should be amended, I think labour super exploitation is a third configuration of surplus value. I think it belongs alongside absolute surplus value and relative surplus value. I'll come to that next time. And if you like, there's two corollaries of that third point. The first is that the ideas of labour superexploitation being real, but not being so fundamental to the capitalist mode of production. In other words, belonging to a more concrete level of abstraction, or a less essential layer of abstraction, not being part of the general definition of the capitalist mode of production, is an argument which has come up a lot now in opposition to our proposal to include labour superexploitation as part of the core theory. So that has led me to question, well, what are the levels of abstraction in Capital? And is it true that volume 1 is at a higher and more fundamental level of abstraction than other volumes? Or is it true that the whole of the 3 volumes are a description of capitalism in general, and then we have to apply them more concretely to any given social formation? So there's a lot of issues there about levels of abstraction, which I will try to explain my take on, at least, as we go through. And then lastly, there are also some writers who do agree that labour superexploitation is very important. It's very important to understand the colonised or subordinated countries in the world. But that does not lead them to the conclusion that superexploitation and oppression are essential relations of the capitalist mode of production. And I think they are. And I think that they modify its general laws of motion. So, I mean, to just give you an example, industrial capitalism in Britain in early 19th century, the leading industry was cotton. Well, I think that the laws of motion should include the exploitation or superexploitation of enslaved labour that made the cotton, as well as the factory workers who weaved and span it here in the UK. All right, so that's kind of like my introduction. Now what I'm going to do with this slide is start moving into the basic content of the first lecture. So I think many of you will be very familiar with this. I'm not teaching you anything you don't know already. The basic structure of Capital, there are 4 volumes, and the first volume 1 was first published in 1867, I think, in the German edition. Now, Marx had written volume 2 and volume 3 in their original drafts by about 1865. He put them to one side to finish off volume 1, ready for publication. So what you have is a certain incompleteness in terms of the work that Marx did before he died. And so he had a concept of them all fitting together in some way, but volume 2 was in a draft state, and Engels put together those drafts and was able to publish that quite quickly. Volume 3 was much more fragmented and incomplete, and so Engels took him about 10 years to actually publish volume 3. And what you find is a lot of debate about the incompleteness of volume 3, which we will come to sooner or later. Alongside these 3 volumes, which deal with the production of capital, the circulation of capital, and then their combination, production and circulation combined, which is what volume 3 is about. So you can see just from the titles, which are slightly understated in the Penguin edition, the titles are really important. And you can see from the titles the sort of the unity of concept between the 3. The theories of surplus value were written in the early 1860s, and they're really an extensive literature critique. So what they do is they look at Ricardo, Smith, Malthus, Robertus, and so on, and they sort of, Marx spins his ideas off his commentary on other writers and political economy. They actually are quite important for volume 3, because some of the key discoveries are quite well articulated in the theories of surplus value. I don't think they have such a strong bearing on the first 2 volumes. So those are the works that we're looking at. And now, how do we understand these works? Well, volume 1 is the foundation. This is very clear, but a foundation is not yet a whole building. and it's a rather mechanical analogy, but you do need the walls and you do need the roof to top it off. And I think that volume 3 is needed to understand Marx's overall explanation of capitalist mode of production. You need to get to the sort of capstone, which is in volume 3. Another major point about Capital, we don't have the possibility of a direct dialogue with Marx about this, but I do kind of like equivocate a bit on his choice of title for the book, because the book isn't about a single subject. This is a really important point, and I guess pretty obvious point, but let's make it. Capital has got a double subject. It's about capital and labour, and in a way it's about capital's relation with labour. The foundation in volume 1 is about that. It's about the relation of exploitation. That's the foundational subject. But it's also true that capital is dominant in the relation. If it wasn't dominant, we wouldn't have very much to do to overthrow it. So the forms of capital in its dominance in the relationship are actually very important for understanding the capitalist mode of production. And then there's a third very important point, which we will come back to and expand, which is all the way through Marx saw the capitalist mode of production, especially in terms of this relationship, as being inverted in reality. And what I mean by that is the inversions weren't just imaginary, they were real. So labor is the source of value, but in reality, it appears as though capital is the source of value. And that's not just an illusion. There are transformations which take place, which, you know, give some substance to that illusion. But so a lot of Marx's effort actually is trying to explain how it is that not everything is what it appears to be at first sight. Okay, and this is a really important point in understanding the incredible intellectual effort which capital is. The second starting point for the subject today is, okay, that's capital in outline. What about dialectics in outline? There are 2 or 3 quite helpful introductions to the idea of dialectics. This is a very standard one, which I do find helpful, from Engels. The underline is me. The italics, which we'll come to, are from Engels. But the underline is really important, and all explanations of dialectics will emphasize it. It's about interconnection. It's about understanding reality, not through a set of isolated instances or examples, but understanding the totality in terms of its interconnectedness. Now, and what Engels does, and this has been quite controversial, is he draws out what he calls 3 sort of basic laws of dialectics. Okay. Now he then applies these 3 laws to his object, which is nature. So after he stated this introduction, then he starts talking about chemical formulae and biology and so on and so forth. Okay. This slightly formulaic interpretation of dialectics is one I want to move away from. And I think actually Engels didn't use it. He had a different application, but I would just say it is a problem in the discussion, right? So I want to connect each of these formula with the context in which it is being made. So the law of transformation of quantity into quality, and a classic physical example is, you know, the freezing point, 0 degrees centigrade, 100 degrees centigrade, the boiling point of water. So that's a very good physical analogy of how quantity turns into quality. It's ice, and then all of a sudden it becomes liquid, and then all of a sudden it becomes gas,